Picture this for a second. You're watching the headlines and it feels like Iran is everywhere at once. Missiles in the news, proxy groups in the region, loud speeches, flags, threats, and big promises. So here is the question that grabs you right away. If Iran looks that aggressive on the outside, how can a top U.S. military voice like General Jack Keane say the Iranian regime is the weakest it has ever been? Is that just political talk for TV? Or are there real cracks showing under the surface? Because this is the thing about regimes like Iran's. Strength isn't just about weapons or slogans. Real strength is about control. It's about legitimacy. It's about money. It's about whether the people inside the country still believe the system can deliver a future. And when you start looking at Iran through that lens, you start to see why some analysts are saying the regime is under more pressure than it has been in decades. General Keane's statement is an opinion, but it's not coming from nowhere. It arises based on a mix of internal stress and external pushback that has been building for years and then got louder recently. And the reason this matters to a U.S. audience is simple. When a regime feels cornered, it can either compromise or it can get more dangerous. Weakness can lead to reform, but weakness can also lead to risk-taking. To understand the weakest ever argument, you have to zoom out. Iran's Islamic Republic was born in 1979, and ever since then, it has survived wave after wave of pressure. A long war with Iraq in the 1980s. Sanctions, isolation, internal protests, leadership changes, and it still stands. So when someone says weakest, it doesn't mean collapsing tomorrow. It means the foundations are wobbling more than the leadership wants the world to see. Start with the most basic issue, the Iranian economy and everyday life. Iran is rich in resources, especially oil and gas, but for many ordinary people, the reality is inflation, unemployment, and a currency that has lost huge value over time. Sanctions play a major role, corruption plays a major role, and mismanagement plays a major role. When people can't plan their lives, when savings melt away, when young adults can't afford marriage, housing, or stability, anger doesn't just vanish. It waits, it builds, and it comes out in waves. If you followed Iran even casually, you've seen those waves. The 2009 protests after disputed elections, the 2019 protests triggered by fuel price hikes, and then the 2022 protests after the death of Mahsa Amini, which turned into something bigger than just one case. Those moments weren't just unrest. They were signals that a large part of the public is exhausted and that the state has to rely more and more on force instead of consent. And ask yourself this. When a government survives mainly by cracking down, is that strength or is that fear? Because fear works, but it has a cost. It forces the regime to spend more resources on internal security. It makes officials suspicious of each other. It creates a culture where bad news gets hidden, so leaders make worse decisions. And it deepens the gap between the state and society. Another pressure point is leadership and succession. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has been in power for decades. In systems like this, one person becomes a symbol holding the whole structure together. But what happens when that person gets older and succession becomes a sensitive topic people whisper about? Even if the regime tries to plan the transition, the fact that everyone is thinking about after creates competition behind the scenes. Different power centers start positioning themselves. The Revolutionary Guard has its interests. Clerical institutions have theirs. Political factions have theirs. And in a system that doesn't allow open debate, that competition happens in the shadows, which often makes it messier. Iran also went through a major political moment recently with the death of President Ebrahim Raisi in a helicopter crash in 2024, and then the election of a new president. No matter what you think about Iranian elections, those transitions still shake the internal balance because power networks have to adjust. When the public already feels disconnected, any transition can feel like the system is unstable, even if the leadership tries to project calm. Now add another layer, brain drain. For years, many of Iran's most talented young people have wanted to leave. Doctors, engineers, entrepreneurs, students. That doesn't mean the country has no talent left, but it does mean the system is constantly losing the kind of human capital it needs to modernize and compete. When a government can't convince its best and brightest to build a future at home, that's not a small weakness. That's a slow bleed. Then there's the legitimacy problem, which is hard to measure but easy to feel. Legitimacy is the invisible glue of any government. It's the feeling that even if you disagree, the system has a right to rule and can deliver some kind of stability and progress. In Iran, the state still has committed supporters, no doubt. But the repeated protest cycles, the intense social restrictions, and the economic pain suggest the regime has a growing legitimacy deficit with a large segment of society. When legitimacy declines, the regime must lean more on coercion, propaganda, and external enemies to hold the story together. And that's where the external piece comes in. When internal pressure rises, regimes often try to redirect attention outward. They talk about national pride, foreign plots, and resistance. Sometimes that messaging works, but sometimes it backfires, especially if ordinary people are thinking, "You're spending money on regional adventures while I can't afford groceries." That tension is one reason analysts argue Iran's strategy of projecting power abroad may no longer produce the same political payoff at home. So when General Keane says weakest, you can interpret it as this. Internally, the Iranian leadership faces a public that is more frustrated, more connected to the outside world, and more willing to challenge the system than in past decades. Economically, the country has been squeezed and mismanaged in ways that grind down daily life. Politically, succession and factional competition create uncertainty. And socially, the divide between the rulers and many of the ruled keeps getting deeper. But that's only half the story. Because Iran's leadership doesn't just wake up and hope things go well. It has tools. It has the Revolutionary Guard. It has intelligence services. It has prisons. It has ideological networks. It has a foreign policy built around influence through partners and proxies. And in the past, those tools helped the regime survive. The real question is whether those tools are still as effective as they once were, or whether they're starting to generate more backlash than control. So let's take the next step. If the regime is under internal strain, what about its position in the region? Is Iran still the chess player moving pieces wherever it wants, or is it now reacting, absorbing hits, and trying to keep its image from cracking? That's where the weakest argument gets even more interesting, because the Middle East has been changing fast, and Iran's old playbook is facing new limits. Think about how Iran projects power without always using its own uniformed army. For years, a big part of Iran's strategy has been what people call the axis of resistance, a network of allied militias and political groups across the region. The idea is simple. Iran builds influence in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, and it creates pressure points against its enemies, especially Israel and the United States. This gives Tehran leverage and deterrence. If Iran is threatened, it can respond indirectly, through partners, in ways that are deniable, or at least complicated. On paper, that looks like strength, and sometimes it is, but here is the twist. Proxy networks are not the same as stable alliances between normal states. They're messy. They're expensive. They can create blowback. And when the region heats up, proxies can drag Iran into escalations it didn't plan, or they can expose Iran's limits when the other side hits back hard. Over the past couple of years, the region has been a pressure cooker, and the temperature rose sharply during the Gaza war. As the conflict expanded, Iranian-aligned groups increased attacks in different theaters. You saw strikes involving militias in Iraq and Syria. You saw the Houthis in Yemen targeting shipping in the Red Sea. You saw constant tension with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the US and its allies responded with military action, increased defenses, and diplomatic pressure. Now ask yourself, when Iran's partners fire rockets or drones and the response is heavy, who pays the cost? Sometimes it's the proxy group. Sometimes it's the local population. Sometimes it's Iran's reputation. The more chaos spreads, the more governments in the region want stability, trade, and investment, not permanent confrontation. That matters because Iranian's influence partially relies on the idea that it's the unstoppable force shaping the region. If more actors start pushing back, the image changes. One moment that made a lot of people take a second look was the direct exchange of strikes between Iran and Israel in 2024. Without getting lost in the weeds, the key point is this. Iran launched a large drone and missile attack, and a coalition of defenses helped intercept much of it. Then Israel responded in a more limited way. Whatever side you sympathize with, one thing became clear to many observers. Big attacks don't automatically mean big results. And when a regime invests heavily in missiles and drones as a deterrent, it doesn't want the world to conclude those systems can be contained or neutralized. So when analysts say Iran looks weaker, part of what they mean is that Iran's deterrence is being tested in public. If your enemies believe you can be blocked, intercepted, or struck back without catastrophic consequences, your threat loses some weight. And when that happens, you have to either escalate to prove you're serious or back off and risk looking exposed. Neither option is comfortable. Another issue is money. Proxy networks, weapons shipments, and regional influence operations cost money. Iran does have revenue, including oil sales, but its economy is under strain, and every dollar spent abroad is a dollar not spent on domestic needs. That doesn't mean Iran will stop, but it does mean there's a constant balancing act, and when your own population is unhappy, foreign spending becomes politically sensitive. Then there's the regional diplomatic landscape. In recent years, some Middle Eastern countries have tried to reduce tensions with Iran, including the Iran-Saudi diplomatic thaw announced in 2023. On the surface, that sounds like Iran gaining breathing room, but it also signals something else. Regional players are trying to manage Iran, contain the chaos, and prevent open war. In other words, they're not simply accepting Iranian dominance. They're building a system where Iran is one player, not the player, And inside Iran's network, there are limits too. Proxies have their own agendas. Hezbollah, for example, is deeply tied to Iran, but it also has to think about Lebanon's fragile situation and its own survival. Militias in Iraq operate in a complex political environment where the Iraqi state, public opinion, and rival groups all matter. The Houthis have their own goals in Yemen. These partners can support Iranian strategy, but they can also complicate it. When Iran looks strong, it's often because the proxy machine is running smoothly. When Iran looks weaker, it can be because the machine is overheating, drawing too much attention and inviting too much retaliation. Now let's talk about the nuclear issue, because it's always in the background like a storm cloud. Iran's nuclear program gives it leverage and bargaining power, and it also creates fear and urgency in the West and among U.S. allies. Over time, Iran has expanded enrichment and reduced cooperation in ways that raise concern. But here's the key. The nuclear program is also a sign of insecurity. Countries that feel safe don't usually chase the ability to sprint toward a nuclear weapon option. They rely on alliances and stable deterrence. Iran, largely isolated, uses the nuclear program as an insurance policy. So if the regime is weakest, does that mean it will rush to a deal? Not necessarily. Weakness can produce compromise, but it can also produce stubbornness. Leaders might think, if we show flexibility now, we look weak. And in a revolutionary ideology system, looking weak can be more dangerous than being poor. At the same time, Iran has faced covert and military pressure on parts of its regional infrastructure over the years. There have been strikes on Iranian-linked targets in Syria, sabotage allegations, cyber operations, and targeted actions that complicate Iran's planning. Again, details vary and are often contested, but the overall effect is real. Iran has to spend more time defending assets, moving carefully, and calculating risk. So what do you get when you add it all up? You get a regime that still has teeth, still has reach, still has ways to hurt people, but is also dealing with more resistance, more interception, more exposure, and more internal strain than it wants to admit. That's why someone like General Keane can look at the board and say, this is the weakest it's ever been. But let us be honest about something. Calling a regime weak can be dangerous if people misunderstand what that means. Weak regimes don't always fade away quietly. Sometimes they lash out. Sometimes they gamble. Sometimes they miscalculate. And when you're dealing with a state that has missiles, drones, intelligence networks, and influence across conflict zones, miscalculation can spiral fast. So here's the question for you. If Iran's leaders feel pressure at home and pressure abroad, what move would you make if you were in their seat? Would you cut a deal to buy time? Would you crack down harder internally? Would you escalate to scare everyone into backing off? Or would you try a mix of all three? Because that's where the story is headed now. The next chapter isn't just about whether Iran is weaker, it's about what Iran does with that weakness, and how the US, Israel, and regional countries respond without triggering a wider war. Now let us talk about what weakest it has ever been could actually lead to, because this is where the future splits into different paths. And the truth is, no one can predict with certainty which path will win. But you can watch for signals, and you can think through the incentives. One possible path is the simplest. The regime absorbs the pressure and survives the way it has survived before. It tightens internal control, arrests more activists, increases surveillance, and tries to manage the economy just enough to prevent total breakdown. It keeps selling oil where it can, keeps building weapon systems. It keeps its proxy network active, but maybe a little more carefully. In this scenario, Iran stays dangerous, but cautious. The leadership's goal would be to outlast its enemies and wait for a better global environment, maybe a shift in US politics, maybe a crisis somewhere else that distracts the world. A second path is reform, but not the kind of reform people in the West often imagine. It could be limited, tactical reform, a few social restrictions loosened here and there, a different tone from a new president, small economic changes to calm the public. Not because the system suddenly becomes democratic, but because the leadership decides it needs to release pressure from the bottle. The risk for the regime is that even small reforms can open the door to bigger demands. And once people taste change, they often want more. A third path is escalation, and this is the one that worries a lot of security analysts. If leaders believe their deterrence is slipping, they may try to restore fear. That could mean more aggressive actions through proxies, more harassment of shipping, more risky moves in the region, or stepping closer to a nuclear threshold to force negotiations on their terms. The danger here is that escalation can invite escalation. And when multiple actors are operating across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Israel, and the sea lanes, one wrong strike can trigger a chain reaction. A fourth path is internal fracture at the top. This doesn't have to mean a revolution in the streets. Sometimes regimes change because elites split. If succession politics intensify, if economic pain shrinks the pool of resources to share, or if security institutions begin competing, you can see cracks inside the ruling coalition. Those cracks are hard to see from the outside until they suddenly become obvious. And when they become obvious, things can move fast. So what should you watch as a normal person in the US who doesn't live in the Middle East but still feels the impact through oil prices, security concerns, and global stability? Watch the street temperature inside Iran. Are protests small and isolated, or do they spread across cities and social groups? Watch whether labor strikes become more frequent, because strikes hit the system where it hurts. Watch the economy, especially inflation and currency value, because that's what ordinary people feel daily. Watch how hard the regime has to push to control information, because heavy censorship often signals fear of losing the narrative. Watch the regional picture too. If proxy attacks increase but start producing diminishing returns, that's a sign Iran is trying to project strength while struggling to create real leverage. Watch whether more regional states quietly coordinate defenses, because that means Iran is being contained. And watch the nuclear file, not just the headlines, but the broader pattern of whether Iran seems to be seeking bargaining space or seeking a breakout option. Now let's bring it back to General Jack Keane's claim. When he says Iran is the weakest it's ever been, he's pointing to a combination of internal discontent, economic strain, leadership uncertainty, and a regional environment that is pushing back harder than before. You don't have to agree with the exact wording to see the logic. Iran is under stress in multiple directions at the same time. But here's another question that matters. Could this weakness actually be temporary? Could Iran adapt and come out more hardened? History says yes, it could. Regimes often learn. They refine their security methods. They adjust their alliances. They find new revenue streams. And sometimes, the moment outsiders assume they're about to fall is the moment they become more unpredictable. That is why it's important not to confuse weaker than before with harmless. A cornered animal can still bite. A pressured regime can still cause major damage. And if Iran's leadership believes its survival is on the line, it may prioritize survival over stability for everyone else. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in a world where the Iranian regime may be facing its deepest legitimacy problems in years, while still having the capability to disrupt the region and challenge the US and its allies. That combination is exactly what makes this moment so tense. Now I want to hear from you, because this story isn't just about missiles and politics, it's about how you read power. When you hear Iran is the weakest it's ever been, do you believe it? Or do you think Iran is simply changing tactics and waiting for the right moment? And if you were advising US policy, would you push for tougher pressure, a diplomatic deal, or something in between? Drop your take in the comments, because I read them, and the best discussions usually come from people disagreeing respectfully with real reasons. And if you know someone who follows global news, someone who cares about US security, or someone who's trying to understand what's really happening with Iran beyond the headlines, share this video with them. It helps the channel, it sparks better conversation, and it tells the algorithm to keep showing deeper content like this instead of just quick hot takes. And as you watch the next set of headlines roll in, remember this: the loudest regimes often shout the most when they are trying to cover the cracks. The real question is whether those cracks get patched, or whether they keep spreading.